From the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
Youth Emergency Services just came through too, and we've got some more pride flags coming through. Got a few more shirts of free mom hugs coming down the way too. Always love to see those.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, gay pride in Nebraska. Joining us to talk more about it is Jay Irwin. Dr. Irwin is an associate professor of sociology at UNO, where he also holds courtesy appointments in women and gender studies, as well as a courtesy appointment in public health at UNMC. Thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you, Kathy.
Dr. Irwin, this is a difficult topic for many people. How would you break the ice before we get started?
I mean, I think one of the things that we can think about when we're talking about pride in general is just being oneself, finding the space to be comfortable, confident, and fully yourself in all spaces. So thinking through, how does sexuality and gender impact that for folks?
Okay. All right. So gay pride also means LGBTQ plus pride. Yeah. Let's start with the letters. What do they stand for?
Yeah, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, transgender, and queer or questioning. Plus is for, there's a ton of other words that, of course, if we put all the letters, the acronym would be very long. Okay. So trying to really get at folks whose sexuality and gender are different than, the standard approved, normal, quote unquote, socially depicted ideas about sexuality and gender.
Let's drill down into those letters just a little bit further. Maybe a 1 or 2 line definition for each of those.
So lesbian, someone who identifies as a woman who is interested in relationships with other women. Gay is an interesting one because it uses kind of a catch-all phrase, but typically when we're talking about the letters individually, gay would be men who are interested in relationships with men. Bi, folks who are interested in multiple genders, so not necessarily one or the other, but multiple genders. Trans for folks whose gender is different than their sex assigned at birth, so who may transition or who feel that their gender is different than what they were assigned at birth and how they were raised. And then queer or questioning. Queer really is a very broad umbrella category to get at folks whose maybe sexuality and or gender is different. Trying to get at that original meaning of the word queer, meaning different, but in celebrating difference being a good thing and not a bad thing. And again, the plus, pansexuality, asexuality, intersex folks, lots of different individual terms, but again, folks who are not heterosexual and whose gender is different potentially than they were assigned at birth.
Okay, and you've said the word several times now. I think one of the misconceptions here is that this is all about sexuality.
Sure.
And really, there's a difference between what gender identity, expression, and sexuality. So how do you explain that to people?
Yeah, well, one of my favorite explanations comes from an author, a trans woman. Her name is Jennifer Finney Boylan, and she describes the difference between gender and sexuality as sexuality is who you want to go to bed with, who are you interested in relationships with, versus gender is who do you want to be when you are in that bed with that other person. What kind of roles do you occupy in the world? How do they interact with you? So it does get really, there's a lot of overlap between these two concepts because our gender does inform how we think about sexuality and how we think about the relationships that we have with those around us. But not every person who is underneath this umbrella is trans. Some people are, lots of people aren't.
Okay, a lot to process there. But Dr. Irwin, at the end of the day, we are just talking about fellow human beings here. So when somebody says to you, well, who are these people?
Right.
Tell me about their day-to-day, for example. Sure. How do you start? Where do you begin? And what do you tell them?
I mean, I typically say, well, these folks are just like every other folks. Their relationships may look a little different than the average person's, but there are neighbors, there are kids, there are nieces and nephews, our siblings. These are, LGBTQ folks make up, every single kind of person that's around us. And I think that's one of the things that Pride is really good at highlighting, is that we are really just right here, and we're not scary, we're here to have a good time, to celebrate our lives, but, that we do everything pretty much just like everybody else does.
Well, have a good time and celebrate is exactly what people did
100%.
On Saturday, July 10th for Heartland Pride. Now, I know that you were part of the festivities. You were there,
Yeah.
you saw the parade and all the rest. We're going to roll some video here.
Yeah.
Tell us what happened.
Yeah. So, the Pride celebration, we had it a little bit late this year. It's usually in June instead of July, but COVID pushed us back a little bit. So, the typical Pride parade, you see lots of groups, lots of color, lots of flags. And I think one of the great things about Pride is that it shows both young people and folks who may be coming out later in life that, there's lots of folks who fit into these categories, and there's support and appreciation for folks.
Okay. And celebrations like this one, always not so common and not so peaceful.
Sure.
One of the other things that we want to be sure to do here, like we do with so many programs, Dr. Irwin, is take a look at the history.
Sure.
How did we arrive where we are today?
Right.
And the Stonewall riots, now I know you mentioned before the program here that there were other riots as well, but that was really the groundbreaking incident. As we roll some more video for our viewers, talk about the Stonewall riots.
Yeah, so historically, gay bars in particular were really sites of a lot of micromanagement, and it was illegal to be an LGBTQ person in the United States, at least for a long time. So Stonewall is a bar still in New York City, frequented by drag performers and other LGBTQ folks. So you see some drag performers there, and it was illegal to be dressed in clothing that was not of the gender that was marked on your legal documents. So that's often how these bars were rated. So in Stonewall, we had a number of days that essentially the folks, we see Sylvia Rivera here, and Marsha P. Johnson, two of kind of the biggest names in terms of the LGBTQ community, trans women, who probably were instrumental in starting this pushback against the police, where they said, you're not going to micromanage our day-to-day lives. We deserve to be here. We can be here and enjoy our culture and our experiences together. And that really was what started Pride. The next year was the first Pride parade in the United States.
Okay, all right, and significant milestones since that time.
Yeah.
Talk to us about those.
Yeah, so Stonewall was 1969. We had the first Pride Parade in 1970 in the United States. We've actually got some Nebraska-specific history. The first LGBTQ studies class ever in the United States was offered at UNL. Who knew? We've got marriage equality now. We're moving towards trans folks having increased access to healthcare needs and things like that. And really, it's about how do we figure out to make sure that folks are protected in the similar way that the Civil Rights Act protected Black folks and people of color. That's really what the current movement is trying to figure out for LGBTQ folks is where are we still experiencing issues of lack of access to things and issues of discrimination, and how can we address those?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Nebraska, and that was a surprising fact for me.
Yeah.
We're going to put up a map for our viewers. And Dr. Irwin, I want you to just kind of let us know, where is Nebraska today in all of this?
Right. So in terms of state-based policies about non-discrimination, Nebraska does not have any state-based policies. Omaha has a non-discrimination ordinance that includes sexual orientation and gender identity. Lincoln passed one a few years ago, then it went through a petition and it got removed. So in the last 4 years, there's been an increased effort in the state unicameral to push for a statewide LGBTQ protection initiative. It's not gotten out of committee once. It's never had a full vote on the floor. The current member of the unicameral is Megan Hunt, who's brought that bill. Patty Pansing Brooks has brought it in the past. Adam Moorfeld's brought it in the past. Attempts to make sure that this group is protected. Because we do have experiences of folks not getting access to things, being removed from locations, being told you can't be here because you're LGBTQ or we think you might be LGBTQ. So that's what these bills are trying to address, is to make sure that folks can fully participate in society.
Put this at a level that we can truly understand. When you say that they're not able to participate, even if you sense somebody might be a certain way, I mean, you know, we've heard a lot about whole person wellness these days, right? So physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, all the rest. So when you're talking about a community who really wants to be considered equal, what are we talking about in terms of deficits right now? Tell me, pick one person that you can think of and walk me through their day in terms of the barriers, the challenges that they're facing.
Sure. Yeah, well, we could talk about, you know, the instance of someone who might be trans, who's trying to navigate healthcare experiences. And this has nothing necessarily to do with the transition, but just like going to the doctor to receive routine care might be really difficult for someone who is part of the LGBTQ community because of fears of, especially in small towns. If we're talking about a town of 400 folks, might have a couple physicians. How does that physician interact with me if I come out and tell them that I'm LGBTQ? And especially for health, we do know that there's some, you know, stressors. Stress is terrible for your health. Being exposed to discrimination or even worrying about discrimination can be really damaging to physical and mental health for folks. So that's one of the areas where, you know, a lot of my research focuses on folks' health and getting access to and making sure clinicians know, how do I talk to someone who's LGBTQ? How do I make sure that they feel comfortable in my clinical environment? Coming to campus, you know, we talk about an LGBTQ young person. How will they experience their faculty members? Will their faculty members understand, you know, if they use a certain set of pronouns or if they use a different name? What does that mean for them? And having folks know what that means and not having to be the one to explain it all the time, it can be a very, you know, tiring thing to have to self-advocate a lot, which, you know, LGBTQ people have to do.
Yeah, you mentioned pronouns, and that's a big one. You know, you'll get an email or you'll get some sort of communication. So let's just set the record straight right now and talk to us a little bit about pronouns and what do they really mean?
Yeah, I mean, pronouns are just the words that you use instead of your name when you're referring to, or when other people are referring to you, really. So, you know, Jay went to the store and he bought broccoli or whatever. And that pronoun, we all use pronouns constantly. And when we're thinking about LGBTQ folks, particularly trans folks and non-binary folks, is figuring out, making sure that folks feel like they're being respected, and a name is a really personal thing. And pronouns and names are one of those things that is an easy way to show someone that you respect them. You know, if this is just a sign of respect. I wouldn't assume your name in the same way that I'm not going to try to assume people's pronouns. That's one of the things that we do on campus a lot is, you know, if you walk into the LGBT space at UNO, you have, what's your name? What are your pronouns? That's just standard course. And it's not a, oh, well, we assume something about you. It's a, we want to know who you are. Who do you say you are, regardless of what your paperwork says or any of that. So pronouns are really just that, similar to a name, it's our personal kind of fingerprint. Like, this is who I am. This is how I interact with the world.
I'm going to talk to you about the Equality Act in just a minute, but I want to go back to something you said about the physicians. So, navigating the healthcare system can be challenging even for the most tuned in individual. So for anybody who's watching today, and for some people it's just hard to carve out the time to get to these appointments. You add fear to that, and now we've really set up kind of a brick wall for folks. Is there a way, Dr. Irwin, you know, there are referrals happening all the time. If somebody logs onto a website or they're looking for a provider, is there a way that they can know if they're going to be more accepted and it won't be quite so scary for them and they can kind of get over that hurdle, or no? I mean,
Yeah, there's not a really good unified way to find that information out. Most of what I see is just recommendations from personal friends. Literally social media pages of like, I need a dentist who won't treat me poorly because I'm LGBTQ. Do you have suggestions? There's countless Facebook groups and other ways that people try to connect virtually to try to understand like where can I get these services. Thankfully, UNMC is a great partner in that. They have a trans clinic specifically for trans folks. They provide HIV services, which of course impacts a certain proportion of the population. And they're a established group in the state for providing LGBT competent care.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to that Equality Act. Tell us what is that?
So the Equality Act is a federal initiative that would bring non-discrimination protection for LGBTQ folks nationwide. So instead of this piecemeal state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, it would say in the United States, similar to how it's illegal to discriminate someone on the basis of race, it would be illegal to discriminate someone on the basis of LGBTQ identity. So this includes public accommodations, so hotels, public spaces. You can't be kicked out of somewhere for being LGBTQ if the Equality Act passed. It's passed the House, it has not passed the Senate. This has also been a bill that's, I can think of knowing about the Equality Bill in some form or fashion for at least the last decade. So it has been similar in Nebraska, it's been a long-standing goal, but it hasn't gotten there yet. So it does leave LGBTQ folks really vulnerable, especially in states that aren't very friendly to LGBTQ folks or who have more conservative governments and systems. So that nationwide ordinance would be really helpful for folks in terms of having LGBTQ folks feel visible by their government in a good way, valued, seen as full citizens and worthy of protection.
Okay, and we have two websites that you talked to us about, and we want to put those up. So we'll put the first one up. Tell us what hrc.org is.
So HRC is the Human Rights Campaign. They're a lobbying organization in DC. When you see the blue and yellow equals stickers on people's cars, that's the Human Rights Campaign. That's their logo. So the Human Rights Campaign advocates for LGBTQ equality topics in DC and across the United States.
Okay.
The other organization is NCTE, National Center for Transgender Equality. So transequality.org is their website, and they specifically focus on, for trans folks, what does equality look like? What does equal access look like? They've got a lot of educational information, they've got a lot of policy information, and they're similar to the Human Rights Campaign where they're doing lobbying on behalf of LGBTQ folks, but specifically focused on trans folks.
Okay, and lots of legislation right now, in fact, more than we've seen in this particular area. Give us some highlights, what's important for us to know as we're sitting here now.
I would say some of the important things is, employment protections for folks, making sure that folks have access to jobs. It's a really key piece. There's also been some really attack legislation around sports, trans folks in sports in particular. We've had a lot of state legislations trying to make, laws about who can participate in girls and boys sports or not. And at the end of the day, some of those lawmakers don't know really what they're trying to do. They don't know enough about gender to really make the law that they want to make. So there's some struggles there with some of those legislations.
Well, so I was going to ask you, what are you doing to educate them a little bit? You're right. If they're the decision makers and they're not really fully informed or as well informed as need be to proceed with something, what are you doing? What's being done to help educate?
Well, there's organizations like Out Nebraska locally that's doing a lot of educational outreach advocacy stuff around legislators and just making the general populace aware of what are the bills that are being proposed, what kind of impacts could they have. And there's just a ton of education that's needed. I mean, for programs just like this, talking about LGBTQ lives, talking about that, this is not a special population. This is a population that has specific circumstances, but same general needs of happiness, well-being, and security. So, it's sometimes we get into the conversation around special rights, which I don't think is really necessarily all that helpful of a conversation, because it's really just it's leveling the field. It's making sure that LGBTQ folks have access to the same stuff.
Well, and another key word we've been hearing. We've been talking about equality today. Inclusion is another big word. And it's interesting, I was thinking about this, what we say and how we say it.
Yeah.
Language, such a powerful tool. So when it comes to inclusion, talk to us a little bit about what we say and how we say it, especially in this day and age.
I mean, I would challenge folks to think about ways to think about inclusion in our language that are gender open, that include ways to think about gender not as just okay men and women, or okay, he, she, thinking about different ways to think about gender, because gender, I think, is one of those things that is going to be the forefront of the LGBTQ community going forward, because we see trans folks on TV now, we see media specials that are dedicated to trans lives and trans topics. So, we've got lots of young people who are looking and saying, where am I? Where do I fit within this? So education, media, there's so many good places to find out more. This is the difficulty of when you open this box, there's lots of other things that start to spill out. So becoming comfortable with Google, I mean, just finding those resources to say, okay, I heard this word, now I don't know what that means. The internet is our lovely place to learn and reflect, and also think about where we fit and how our ideas are formed, and where did we get those ideas about gender.
Okay, so I want to ask, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
So I think one of the big, obviously, fear and a lack of education, big things, but let's just say you're an individual who wants to be open, right, wants to be inclusive, but you run into somebody who looks a lot different than you, acts a lot different than you, and you don't know the first thing to say or to do with that individual. So instead, you go the other way.
Sure.
You avoid, right? Because we just don't know. So talk to our viewers a little bit, when you do run into that individual, regardless of who he or she is, that's different from you. How do you approach them without you yourself having that fear?
Sure. Well, I think we're all a little worried when we're talking to folks that we don't know. I mean, I think that's just the pretty normal human response. I think one of the things is it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. I mean, it matters to who that person is and feeling whole and secure, but probably their LGBTQ identity, while it may be interesting, it probably doesn't impact that other person all that much. So it's like what do you need out of this interaction? Do you just need to have a conversation? And it might be that their gender and their sexuality doesn't actually matter at the end of the day. But sometimes it does, and it could be hi, my name is Jay. How are you today? Just simple opening conversations. It seems really hard, and it seems really scary, because it is. And I think that's the thing, when we're talking about openness and inclusion for LGBTQ identities, as you learn, you will mess up. And that's part of it. But when you mess up, you learn from it. That's hopefully the goal, is that we learn from our mistakes. And when we're learning in this new kind of open environment that we're moving towards, it's okay to slip up, and then you just move on. And then you just get to know that person as a human, on a real, hopefully emotional level, in the same way that you'd get to know anybody.
Well, and I like that you've said, what do you want from this conversation? Because you're absolutely right. It doesn't matter about whom we're speaking. If they're different than you and you give them a chance and you open up that dialogue, to your point, it may not always go well.
Sure.
But at least it goes.
Right.
And you're a step closer than you were before. Now I want to speak to the people watching who are saying, I like this Dr. Irwin, and I like what he's saying, and I really want to get behind this movement.
Yeah.
So what are, other than Heartland Pride, and I know that there are some other things coming up in the state too yet this year, and June is the official month, what types of things can they or should they be doing to really advocate and get behind this?
I mean, I would really pay attention to what's happening within your local governments. So Omaha City Council if you live in Omaha, Lincoln if you live in Lincoln, wherever your jurisdiction is. But then think about who your state representatives are. Who's advocating for you in the legislature, and are they actually advocating for what you believe in or not? So as it relates to, the average person in Nebraska or Omaha, there's a lot of organizations that are really great that are doing advocacy work. So Out Nebraska is one. There's a lot of great momentum around an organization called Black and Pink, which is headquartered in Nebraska. It's a nationwide LGBTQ organization, but it's here in Omaha. For as small of a city that Omaha is, it's got a lot of LGBTQ resources and a sizable population, a very active group in Omaha in particular. So there's lots of ways to get plugged in. At Heartland Pride, places like UNO, the LGBT Center at UNO, is a place to plug in as well.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes remaining. I want you to speak specifically now to people who have been thinking about coming out, and they're just scared. They just don't know what they're going to be stepping into.
Sure.
So in about a minute, what would you say to them?
I would say think about who might be the safest person for you to talk to. Finding a human who you know is going to have your back regardless. Because sometimes that coming out can be very difficult. And it doesn't happen at any certain time. It doesn't happen at any certain stage of someone's life. It could happen at any point in time. I've definitely known folks in the last year who have come out in their 30s, 40s, 50s, etc. So finding that human, sometimes it might be a spiritual mentor, a best friend, a partner, a parent, and having that dialogue, it's worth it. At the end of the day, it is worth it. Sometimes it is a difficult conversation for sure. It is scary, but speaking one's truth is a very liberating and freeing experience. And the stress of being in the closet is negative for us too. So there are resources to help, especially for young folks, and having that support, being able to be your full self and get support is just words can't put into really full.
Okay, so receiving end, 30 seconds. Those on the receiving end, just listen. Is there more that they should be doing?
Just listen, provide support, say thank you for telling me that must have been hard. Empathy. Empathy goes a very, very long way.
Okay, we are talking about Gay Pride in Nebraska today with Dr. Jay Irwin. Folks wanting more information, we did pick some websites, so we're going to go ahead and direct our viewers to those now. freedomforallamericans.org, heartlandpride.org, and unomaha.edu. Dr. Irwin, I want to thank you so much for being here today, sharing your time, expertise, and your stories. Keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
We wish you well.
Thank you.
You bet. And I want to thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at nebraskapublicmedia.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call UNO Television at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours, or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.